Its name is Allegory of Satan, Lord of the World. It was painted by a Polish artist called Ludwik Stasiak around the year 1900. It measures 1 meter 45 by 2 meters, and today it is kept at the National Museum in Krakow, Poland, under the inventory number MNK2B3252. It is, without any doubt, the best-known work of his entire career, and also the strangest, because when you look at it for the first time, you don't understand what this painting is doing in this artist's catalog, and when you finally understand it, you can't stop thinking about the message it hides. But to understand that message, we first need to talk about who Ludwik Stasiak was, because without knowing the man, the painting doesn't carry the same weight. Part 1. The man that almost nobody knows outside of Poland. Ludwik Józef Stasiak was born on August 13, 1858, in Bochnia, a city in southern Poland. His father worked in the famous Bochnia salt mine, and Ludwik grew up in a middle-class family that gave him access to the education that would shape his entire life. When he reached the right age, he was sent to Krakow to attend the gymnasium, and in 1879, upon graduating, he made a decision that perfectly defines what kind of man he was. He enrolled, at the same time, in the philosophy program at Jagiellonian University and in painting at the Academy of Fine Arts. Not one or the other, both at once. His teachers at the Academy were some of the most important names in Polish art of the period: Isidor Jabłonski, Władysław Łuszczkiewicz, Florian Sink, Leopold Loeffler, and above all, Jan Matejko, the great Polish history painter. His monumental compositions about the history of Poland were, at that moment, much more than art. They were an act of cultural resistance. After his studies in Krakow, Stasiak traveled abroad. He spent time in Vienna, and then in Munich, which at that time was one of the most important artistic centers in Europe, a place where painting students from all over the continent converged, including a significant number of Polish artists who were seeking training without giving up their identity. In 1890, Stasiak returned to Krakow, and that same year, he attended an event that may seem anecdotal, but is actually revealing about the environment in which he moved. He went to the famous wedding of the poet and painter Włodzimierz Stetmajer to a peasant woman named Maria Mikołajczykówna, held in the village of Bronowice. That wedding brought aristocrats, intellectuals, and Polish peasants together at the same table, and it became a symbol of the so-called peasant mania of the artists of the period. So much so, that years later the playwright Stanisław Wyspiański would use it as direct inspiration for his play Wesele, today considered one of the peaks of Polish literature. Stasiak was not a passive observer of his time. He was an active participant. In 1893, Count Korwin Milewski helped him organize his first solo exhibition, and from that moment on, Stasiak became a regular exhibitor at the Krakow Society of Fine Arts. Throughout his career, he would present a total of 142 works there. And what did he paint? Above all, Polish rural landscapes, genre scenes of peasant life, historical compositions, religious themes, works deeply rooted in Polish identity, works that, in the political context of the period, had a very concrete function: to visually preserve a culture that the occupying powers were trying to erase. In 1895, Stasiak returned to his hometown, Bochnia, and there he opened a studio that became a meeting point for artists of the movement known as Young Poland. 3 years later, in 1898, he made another significant move. To counter the dominance of German and Austrian painters in the religious art printing business, he founded his own art publishing house, a publishing house that would later be called Stella. He was a painter, he was a journalist, he was a publisher, he was an art historian, he was a novelist. Ludwik Stasiak was, in the end, the kind of person who in his time was called a man of culture. someone who did not conceive of art as an isolated activity, but as part of a broader project of building and defending a collective identity. And that is exactly why, around the year 1900, he painted this image of Satan. Part 2. The context that explains everything. To understand this painting, we first have to understand what Poland was in the year 1900, and the answer is disconcerting. Poland, in 1900, did not exist. It did not exist as a state. It did not exist on any map. It had been erased from the map of Europe in 1795, when the Third Partition of Poland, carried out by the Habsburg monarchy, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Russian Empire, permanently eliminated the Polish state from the continent. By the time Stasiak painted this work, Poland had been without existing as an independent nation for exactly 105 years, and it would not regain that independence until 1918. That is, 18 years later. In total, 123 years without a country of its own, without a capital, without an army, without recognized borders, only a language, a history, and a cultural memory that its inhabitants passed from generation to generation, many times through art, precisely because art was one of the few channels that the occupying powers could not fully control. That was the world in which Stasiak lived, a world in which painting a Polish landscape, portraying a Polish peasant, or evoking an episode of Polish history was an act charged with political significance. His teacher Jan Matejko had understood this perfectly decades before. The generation of painters to which Stasiak belonged saw artistic expression as a patriotic and personal responsibility, not just as an aesthetic practice. But 1900 was not only the year of Polish anxieties, it was the turn of the century. And the turn of the century, in Europe, was a moment of deep cultural unease for the entire continent. In 1859, 41 years earlier, Charles Darwin had published On the Origin of Species, and with that book, he shook the foundations of the Christian faith, calling into question centuries of certainties about the place of human beings in the universe. In 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche had published The Gay Science, the book in which the phrase that would resonate for decades appears for the first time: God is dead. Industrialization, for its part, had generated a new class of people for whom money, progress, and material accumulation had replaced God as the organizing principle of life. And in that context, in Poland, at that crossroads between national anxieties and collective spiritual crises, an artistic and literary movement was born, known as Młoda Polska, Young Poland. Part 3. Young Poland and the Spirit of the End of the Century. Młoda Polska was a modernist period in the Polish visual arts, literature, and music. It extended, approximately, between 1890 and 1918. The term was coined by the writer Artur Górski in a manifesto published in 1898 in the Krakow newspaper Życie, which means life. The movement promoted decadentism, neo-romanticism, symbolism, impressionism, and Art Nouveau. And just like the previous generations of Polish painters, its artists understood cultural creation as a form of resistance. Preserving the identity of a nation that had no state was, in itself, a form of struggle. But young Poland also absorbed the spiritual and philosophical currents of end-of-century Europe. The Polish-Swedish art critic Joanna Persman has reflected on how decadent, romantic, and even Satanist ideals proliferated in the Młoda Polska environment, especially in the circle of the writer Stanisław Przybyszewski and his followers. The figure of Satan was not, in that context, simply a religious image. It was a symbol loaded with philosophical, political, and moral meanings. A symbol that the artists of the period used to say things that, otherwise, would have been difficult to say directly. That was the environment in which Stasiak lived and worked. And although he did not formally belong to the symbolist movement, the influence of painters like Jacek Malczewski, the great figure of young Poland, known for his complex allegories that mixed Polish history, mythology, and personal visions, can be traced in the more evocative phases of his work. The painting of Satan is, in many senses, the work in which that intersection of influences becomes most visible. Part 4. The painting. When we look at Allegory of Satan, Lord of the World, the first thing that draws our attention is what isn't there. There are no flames. There are no deformed creatures. There are no infernal landscapes. There is nothing of what the popular imagination associates with a representation of the devil. What there is, instead, is a young man who is seated, and that posture says everything. Satan is not standing. He is not advancing. He is not threatening. He is seated comfortably, with the composure of someone who does not need to move because he has already won. His posture is that of a ruler, and Stasiak dressed him accordingly. He wears a tunic of dark red and green, the traditional colors of royalty. Around his neck hangs an ornate medallion, the kind of jewelry worn by kings and princes of the church in the medieval period. On his head, a crown, and in his left hand he holds a golden scepter, crowned by a small demonic figure. An object that, in the Christian tradition, is a symbol of spiritual authority. It is, in all its details, the representation of a sovereign. Behind him, a pair of bat wings spread out, gray, dull, deliberately in contrast with the richness of his attire. They are not the fallen wings of a defeated angel. They are the wings of something that rules from the shadows. That does not need to display its power, because it already exercises it. At his feet, the throne is flanked by lions' heads, and this detail is not decorative. In Christian iconography, the lion is the animal with which the first letter of Peter describes the devil, like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Stasiak knew perfectly well what he was doing by placing those heads there. To the left of the throne, peacock feathers. The peacock was, in symbolic tradition, the emblem of vanity and pride, the first and most serious of the deadly sins, and precisely the sin that, according to Christian theology, caused the fall of Lucifer. It is not an ornament, it is a signature. Hand on the floor, scattered around the throne, there are skulls. Some wear crowns, others wear hats, others seem to wear warriors' helmets. Kings, nobles, soldiers. The skulls are not there to frighten. They are there as a record, as an inventory of all those who passed through that same place before us. All those who believed they could negotiate with what this smiling young man was offering them. All those who followed the trail that leads to him. Because there is a trail, in the foreground of the painting, among the skulls, winding toward the throne, there is a row of gold coins. That trail of coins is the central argument of the work, the axis around which everything else revolves. And Stasiak emphasizes it by placing one more coin in Satan's own right hand, extended toward us, as if it were the last piece of a chain that we have already begun to follow. The correct way to read this painting is from bottom to top. Let's imagine that we have seen the first coins on the ground. We have picked them up. We have advanced. We have followed the trail among the skulls, without stopping to look at them. And at some moment, when we raise our eyes, we find ourselves face to face with this young man who looks directly at us and smiles. The smile is the most disturbing detail of the painting. It is not a threatening grimace. It is not an expression of hatred or contempt. It is a smile of recognition. The smile of someone who already knew you were going to arrive. Part 5. The message. With all these elements on the table, the message of the painting becomes clear, but it also becomes uncomfortable in a way that few works of art achieve. Stasiak did not paint Satan to frighten anyone. He painted him to propose a reading of the world around him, a reading in which evil does not present itself as something monstrous and easily recognizable, but as something elegant, comfortable, and extraordinarily seductive. The title of the work is fundamental: Lord of the World, not Lord of Hell, not Lord of the Dead, Lord of the World. This world, that of 1900, that of the great industrial fortunes, that of money, which had replaced God as the organizing principle of life, that of the crowns that bent before capital, that of the warriors who died for the ambitions of kings who, in turn, served interests they did not fully understand. The skulls are not victims of evil in the sense in which we usually understand it. They are people who made a decision, the same decision that this painting is offering us now, painted at the crossroads between two centuries, in a Poland that did not exist on maps but survived in the consciousness of its artists. This work is, simultaneously, many things: a religious reflection, a political critique, a philosophical meditation on power and vanity, and a moral warning that does not need to point a finger at anyone in particular, because it points at everyone. Evil, as it is presented here, does not come looking for you. It waits for you, seated comfortably on its throne, with its crown, its scepter, and its smile, surrounded by the remains of all those who arrive before you. It holds out its last coin, and simply waits for you to finish following the trail. Part 6. What happened next? What makes this painting even more striking is what happened right after Stasiak finished it. Around 111, 1 year after having painted it, Ludwik Stasiak almost completely stopped painting. His interests, which for decades had been focused on painting, shifted abruptly to literary work. He began to write historical novels, short stories, and 3 volumes of humorous sketches that turned out to be very popular with the Polish public. We don't know what led him to create this image. There is no written document, no letter, no public statement in which Stasiak explains why he painted this work, or what exactly he meant to say with it. And that absence of explanation is, in a certain way, consistent with the very logic of the painting. A work that does not explain its message because it trusts the viewer to be capable of reading it for themselves. What we do know is that Stasiak continued to be an active figure in Polish cultural life until the end of his life. He got involved in historical research on Polish art, arguing that certain works attributed to German artists were, in reality, of Polish origin, an extension perfectly consistent with his lifelong commitment to the cultural identity of his nation. His son Tadeusz followed in his footsteps as a painter. In 1918, Poland finally regained its independence, the dream that had driven a great part of the art of his generation. Stasiak lived to see it. He died on December 3, 1924, in Bochnia, the same city where he had been born 66 years earlier. In 2008, the Bochnia City Council declared that year the year of Ludwik Stasiak. Today, there is a museum in that city, which features a permanent exhibition of his works. His paintings have appeared at auction on various occasions, with a record price of $5,521, recorded since 2011. He is a name almost unknown outside of Poland, and most of those who do know him precisely because of this painting, the most unusual of his entire career, the one that least resembles the rest of his work, and yet, the one that condenses better than any other what Stasiak thought about the world in which he lived. Conclusion. Why this painting still works? We opened this video by saying that this is a painting about Satan that does not use any truly frightening element to disturb you. Now, having gone through everything that is inside this work, I think we can be more precise. What makes this painting disturbing is not what it shows. It is what it assumes. It assumes that we recognize the trail of coins, because we have seen trails like that before. It assumes that we understand the smile, because we have seen that smile before. It assumes that the skulls with crowns feel familiar to us, because we know enough history to know that power bends, that fortunes corrupt, that those who believed they were negotiating from a position of strength ended up being just another skull on the floor. Ludwik Stasiak painted this work around the year 1900, in a country that did not exist, at the crossroads between a century that was ending and another that was beginning, loaded with uncertainties. He painted it at a moment in which God had been declared dead by the philosophers, in which Darwin had shaken the foundations of faith, in which money and industrial progress had generated a new form of devotion, one that did not name any god, but that obeyed with the same blind fidelity. And in that context, he painted Satan, not roaring, not threatening, seated, smiling, waiting. 125 years later, the painting is still in the National Museum in Krakow. The skulls are still on the floor, the trail of coins is still there, and the hand extended with the last coin still points directly at us. The question that Stasiak left unanswered. 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 The question that Stasiak left unanswered is the same question that this work asks anyone who stops long enough in front of it. Have you already picked up any of those coins?